I sit in the quiet of the convent library, where the walls are lined with books older than my own memories. The air is still, touched only by the faint ticking of a wooden clock and the distant echo of bells outside. People who come here often ask me about prayer, about faith, about God's mercy. Rarely do they ask me about the life I lived before I chose this path. That silence has suited me for many years, because the truth I carry is not gentle. It is jagged and sharp, a story carved into me by betrayal. There is a heaviness in admitting that. For a long time, I thought my voice had no right to be heard, that my pain was a private weight to be hidden. Yet I have come to realize that secrets are chains, and chains are meant to be broken. If my words today can reach even one soul, perhaps, a young girl sitting alone in her room, believing she is the only one who suffers, then breaking my silence will be worth it. I will not tell this story with bitterness, though there was a time when bitterness threatened to consume me. I will not tell it with shame, though shame shadowed my steps for far too long. Instead, I tell it with honesty. I tell it as someone who has walked through darkness, and by grace and by stubborn endurance found a measure of light again. You see, I was not always the woman you see before you. Long before I ever wore a black habit or whispered prayers in Latin, I was just a child in a small American town. My life was ordinary, filled with school books, laughter, and the sound of cicadas in the summer evenings. We were not a perfect family, but to the outside world we looked stable, even blessed. A home with parents who worked hard, siblings who played in the yard, dinners at the same worn wooden table every night. That table became the stage of both joy and fracture. It was there we celebrated birthdays. There my father told his stories about his younger years, and there where we bowed our heads before meals, speaking grace with folded hands. But beneath the surface of those rituals lived an unease I could not name when I was little. It was the kind of unease that makes you sit up at night, heart pounding, unsure why you feel unsafe in the very place you should be protected. For years I buried those feelings, convincing myself they were imagination, the wild fears of a sensitive child. But a child knows when trust is being broken, even if she cannot yet put the language to it. That is the thread that would unravel my innocence. I share this not to dwell on the cruelty I endured, but to help you understand the wound at the center of my story. Betrayal, especially when it comes from those who share your blood, leaves scars unlike any other. It tears apart the foundation of trust, and once that foundation crumbles, every step forward feels uncertain. That is what happened to me. Even now, as I look back, I see that young girl in my mind, sitting quietly at the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, afraid to breathe too loudly. I remember how she clutched her notebook to her chest, scribbling down little prayers she was too afraid to speak aloud. "God, please make me invisible," she wrote once in shaky handwriting. Those words, innocent yet desperate, still ache in my chest when I think of them. For a long time, I thought no one would ever hear those words, not even God. I thought my prayers floated into silence, unanswered and forgotten. But life has a way of surprising us, even in the bleakest moments. The prayers of a wounded child can become the strength of a grown woman, though the path from one to the other is long and lined with tears. I will tell you how that path unfolded for me, how silence turned into revelation, how revelation tore my family apart, how I ran from the pieces and tried to build a new life, and how, slowly and painfully, healing found me in places I never expected. It is only fair, though, that I tell you who I am before we walk any further together. My name is Marian O'Connell. Today I am known as Sister Marian within these convent walls. But long before that title was mine, I was simply a daughter, a sister, a girl who trusted too easily and paid dearly for it. As I speak, my voice may tremble, but I will not turn away from the truth. I will not dress it in flowers or pretend it was anything other than what it was, because betrayal destroyed me once. And it was only in facing that destruction that I found the courage to rebuild. Not into the girl I once was, but into the woman who sits before you now. And so, this is where my confession begins, not in triumph, not in peace, but in the raw wound of betrayal. That wound will take us back through the years, through the nights of silence and the days of fear, through the breaking and the mending. It will not be an easy journey, but it is a necessary one. If you stay with me, you will come to see not only the pain, but the strange and miraculous ways that grace can thread itself through even the darkest chapters of life. You will come to understand why I chose the life I did, why I vowed myself to Christ, and why even now, with scars that still ache, I can say that love, true, steadfast love, was never lost to me entirely. This is the first step into the story. I have carried in silence for too long, and though the memories still sting, though the betrayal still whispers in the quiet hours of the night, I choose to tell it. Because silence once chained me, and now, at last, I am free. When I look back on the earliest years of my life, I find myself torn between two images. One is bright, filled with the soft colors of summer fields, the scent of bread baking in our small kitchen, the sound of my father's boots at the door when he returned from work. The other is darker, shadowed by an unease I could never name at the time. That tension, the warmth of an ordinary childhood and the chill of something hidden beneath, would define much of my story. Our home sat on the edge of a quiet town where everyone knew one another. Neighbors waved from their porches, and Sunday mornings meant nearly the whole community filing into the white steepled church that stood proudly at the center of town. To the outside world, my family appeared ordinary, even admirable. My father worked long hours to keep us comfortable. My mother balanced household duties with an eye on our education, and we children played in the dusty yard until the street lights flickered on. Inside those walls, there were moments of real happiness. I remember long evenings of board games at the kitchen table, my brothers teasing me when I took too long to decide on a move. I remember my mother's lullabies when storms rattled the windows, her voice soft and steady against the thunder. I remember the way my father told us stories about his own boyhood, spinning them into grand adventures where he was always the mischievous hero. Those were the times when I felt safe, when I believed that family meant sanctuary. But even then, even in that supposed safety, something gnawed at me. Children notice what adults dismiss. I noticed the quick flashes of anger in my father's eyes when the house grew too loud. I noticed the tightness in my mother's smile when she tried to smooth over arguments at the dinner table. I noticed, most of all, the small but growing ways my older brothers treated me, not just as a sister, but as someone they could control. At first, it was little things, keeping me out of games, mocking my voice, insisting I follow their commands. To anyone else, it might have seemed like typical sibling rivalry. To me, it planted seeds of unease. Yet those doubts were easy to bury in the distractions of youth. I loved school, especially the smell of fresh notebooks and the sound of chalk on the blackboard. I loved tracing letters with my pencil until the shapes became second nature. I dreamed of being a teacher someday, standing in front of a classroom filled with children eager to learn. At church, I listened closely to the priest's homilies, not so much for the theology, but for the rhythm of his voice, the sense of calm it carried. Faith to me then was not doctrine, it was comfort. Some of my fondest memories are of summer afternoons when my mother would send us outside to play. The yard behind our house stretched into a field where tall grass swayed and fireflies gathered. Once the sun dipped low, we ran barefoot, shouting, laughing, chasing one another until our legs ached. Those moments felt endless, as though childhood itself could be preserved in the amber glow of twilight. I see that little girl still, the one who climbed trees too high, who laughed when she tumbled into the dirt, who carried a sense of wonder in her pocket like a secret treasure. She is the girl I mourned later when her innocence was fractured. She is the girl I often wished I could return to, as though stepping backward in time might undo everything that came after. Family dinners were another kind of anchor. We gathered around the worn wooden table each evening, my father carving meat, my mother passing bread, voices overlapping as stories spilled across plates. I can still hear the clatter of silverware, the smell of roasted chicken, the warmth of laughter that for a while drowned out my private unease. That table was both haven and stage, where my family appeared strongest and where cracks slowly formed. At that age, I believed deeply in the permanence of family. Teachers told us about loyalty, about the unbreakable bonds between siblings. Sunday school lessons spoke of honoring parents, of keeping family close. I believe those words with all the trust a child can hold, and perhaps that is what made the betrayal that would follow so devastating. I had no framework for imagining that those closest to me could also be the ones to cause me harm. I share these memories because they matter. It would be easy to skip ahead, to dive straight into the pain, but that would rob the story of its true weight. Pain has meaning only when set against what was lost. My laughter, my dreams of teaching, my barefoot summers, the comfort of my mother's lullabies, these were real, precious, and they shaped me. When they were shattered, it was not simply trauma I carried, but the grief of losing an entire world that once felt safe. As I write this in memory, I realize how fragile childhood really is. It is not a fortress, it is glass. It sparkles beautifully in the light, yet one fracture can send cracks running across the whole surface. My childhood was not taken in one blow, but slowly, steadily, through betrayals that began small and grew into something much larger. The girl who once scribbled dreams of teaching on scraps of paper would soon begin scribbling prayers instead. Not for a classroom, but for escape, for safety, for peace. Those prayers began in the days when laughter still filled the yard and the dinner table still rang with stories. They began before the shadows grew too heavy. I often wonder if God looked down on that little girl in her innocence and whispered, "Hold on. The pain will come, but so will healing." I cannot know for certain, but I do know that the memory of those bright days sustained me, even in the darkest nights. They reminded me that there was once light, and that if it existed once, it might exist again. The story I tell now cannot be understood without those beginnings, because when betrayal finally arrived, it came not to a hardened soul, but to a child who still believed in the goodness of family. And that made the fracture all the more shattering. There comes a point when a child's unease is no longer just a whisper in the night, but a heavy presence that follows her every step. For me, that moment arrived in my own home, the place that should have been my refuge. The brothers I had once chased through fields and laughed with around the dinner table became the very source of my dread. Their teasing sharpened into cruelty, their control tightened into something I could not escape. At first, I tried to dismiss it. I told myself they were just older, that boys could be rough, that perhaps I was too sensitive. But deep down, I knew this was different. It was not the playful rivalry that siblings often share. It was a deliberate twisting of power, a slow suffocation of trust. The walls of my room, once covered in school projects and childish drawings, became walls of a cage. I locked my door whenever I could, though even that thin barrier offered little peace. Children rarely have words for the ways they are wounded. I did not. What I had instead was silence. Silence that grew heavier each time I lay awake, heart pounding, waiting for the sound of footsteps in the hall. Silence that crushed me at the breakfast table where everyone else carried on as though nothing was amiss. Silence that screamed inside me when I forced a smile at school, afraid that anyone might see the truth written on my face. The betrayal was not only in the acts themselves, but in what they stole from me. My home became unfamiliar. My laughter muted, my faith in family fractured. I carried shame that did not belong to me, but shame is not logical. It burrows deep, convincing you that you are the one at fault. I thought if I had been stronger, louder, braver, maybe it would have stopped. But instead, I shrank smaller and smaller, trying to disappear into myself. I remember one night sitting on the edge of my bed with a notebook in my lap. I wrote a prayer, the kind of prayer only a child could write, pleading, desperate, simple. God, please make me invisible. Please make them stop. I folded the paper and tucked it under my pillow, as though hiding it there might bring protection. It did not, but it gave me the faintest sense of being heard, even if only by the shadows. The days blurred together. School became an escape, though I often struggled to focus. Teachers noticed the drop in my grades, but I brushed off their concern with quick excuses. Friends invited me to birthday parties, but I declined, too drained by the weight I carried. At home, my world grew smaller, until it was little more than the four walls of my room and the locked diary where I poured out my fears. What haunted me most was not only the harm itself, but the certainty that no one would believe me if I spoke. My brothers whispered those words often enough. No one will take your side. If you say anything, they'll think you're lying. And I believed them. They were older, stronger, louder. I was just the quiet sister, the one who cried too, easily, the one who already seemed fragile. Who would listen to me over them? So I kept silent. That silence became a second prison, one I carried even when I left the house. At church, when the priest spoke of forgiveness, I felt sick. Forgiveness for what? How could I forgive what no one else even acknowledged? I sang the hymns, but my voice trembled. I knelt to pray, but my mind raced with fear. Faith, once my comfort, became complicated. I still believed in God, but I wondered why he seemed so far away. The betrayal cut deeper because it came from those who should have been my protectors. Siblings are meant to shield one another, to share secrets, to stand side by side against the world. Instead, mine became the ones I needed protection from. That inversion shattered something essential in me. I could not trust easily, not even when others extended kindness. Every smile felt suspicious. every gentle word like a trap. Looking back, I see that what I endured was more than the cruelty of individuals. It was the collapse of the very idea of safety. When a child loses that, she loses more than her innocence. She loses her anchor, drifting in a sea where every wave feels threatening. That is how I lived, adrift, untethered, terrified. There were moments when I thought of running away, though I had nowhere to go. I packed a small bag once, just a sweater, a few dollars from my allowance, and a photograph of my mother holding me as a baby. I stood at the back door, hand trembling on the knob, but I could not open it. Fear held me in place. Fear and the faint hope that maybe things would change if I just stayed quiet long enough. But silence never changes what festers in the dark. It only allows it to grow. The betrayal at home seeped into every part of me. My grades slipped further, my friendships faded, my laughter disappeared. I walked through hallways at school like a ghost, unnoticed, unseen. Teachers commented on my tired eyes. My mother asked if I was sick. I shook my head, always insisting. I was fine. I was never fine. What I needed was someone to see me, truly see me. But in those years, I felt invisible in the worst way, not hidden from harm, but hidden from help. I was a child carrying a secret too heavy for her small frame, a secret that bent her shoulders and stole her voice. It is difficult to write these words now, even after all these years. Part of me still trembles at the thought of naming what happened, even in this veiled way. But I must. Because without acknowledging the depth of that betrayal, the rest of my story cannot be understood. Betrayal in the home is a wound that bleeds into every other part of life. It shapes how you see the world, how you see yourself, how you even see God. For me, it planted the belief that I was broken beyond repair, that I was unworthy of love or trust. That belief would take years to unlearn, and even now, it sometimes whispers in the corners of my mind. Yet even in those darkest nights, something fragile held me together. Maybe it was faith, however wounded. Maybe it was the memory of those summers chasing fireflies. Maybe it was the stubborn hope of a child who still dreamed of teaching, of living, of being free. Whatever it was, it kept me breathing when despair threatened to smother me. That fragile thread would be tested again and again. Because betrayal does not stay hidden forever. Secrets unravel, whether we want them to or not. And mine was about to be forced into the light. After betrayal had rooted itself in my home, silence became my closest companion. I carried it with me everywhere, into the classroom, into the church pew, into my bed at night when sleep refused to come. Silence was my shield, but it was also my prison. I thought if I never spoke, if I kept everything buried, then maybe the nightmare would fade. Instead, it grew heavier with every day that passed. At school, I learned how to disappear in plain sight. I sat near the back of classrooms, head bent, eyes fixed on my notebook. Teachers called my name, and I answered in a voice so quiet that even I could barely hear it. The girl who once loved to raise her hand with excitement became the girl who prayed not to be noticed. My grades slipped, and though a few teachers expressed concern, I brushed them off with mumbled excuses about being tired or distracted. No one pressed harder. It was easier for everyone to accept my silence than to question it. Friendships that once colored my life began to fade. When classmates invited me to parties or sleepovers, I declined, claiming headaches or family obligations. The truth was, I no longer knew how to laugh freely, how to join in games or conversations without feeling like an imposter. The betrayal at home had carved a canyon between me and the rest of the world, and I did not know how to cross it. At home, the silence was heavier still. I avoided my brothers as best I could, locking myself in my room, pretending to study, scribbling, prayers in the margins of my notebooks. At the dinner table, I spoke only when spoken to, answering in clipped sentences. My mother often sighed at my quietness, asking if something was wrong, but when I shook my head, she seemed relieved to let the subject drop. My father, preoccupied with work, rarely noticed. To them, I was simply shy, withdrawn, a girl entering that difficult stretch of adolescence. But I knew the truth. My silence was not a phase. It was survival. Nights were the worst. Sleep rarely came without a fight. I would lie awake, eyes wide in the dark, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Every creak of the house sent my heart racing. Some nights I managed only a few restless hours before dragging myself to school with heavy eyes. Other nights I found myself curled in the corner of my room, clutching a pillow, whispering prayers into the darkness. Please, God, please make it stop. Those words became my lullaby. I began locking my bedroom door, though the flimsy lock offered little reassurance. Still, the sound of it clicking into place gave me a small sense of control, the illusion of safety. I pushed furniture against the door at times, stacking chairs or my school bag as a barrier. It was never enough, but it gave me something to do with my fear. Silence, however, is not empty. It is filled with echoes, echoes of what you cannot say, what you are too afraid to name. Those echoes followed me into my dreams. I woke often with a start, heart racing, tears on my cheeks, the fragments of nightmares clinging to me long after the sun had risen. Some mornings, I stared into the mirror and barely recognized the girl looking back. Her eyes were shadowed, her smile absent, her spirit worn thin. There were moments when I thought about breaking my silence. Once, during a health class at school, the teacher spoke about boundaries and respect, about how no one had the right to make you feel unsafe. My hands trembled, and I wanted desperately to raise my voice, to say, "That's happening to me." But the words stuck in my throat. Fear sealed them there. I imagined my classmates' faces twisting in disbelief, my teacher's eyes narrowing in suspicion, my family's anger crashing down upon me. The thought was unbearable, and so I stayed silent. Another time, I tried to confide in a close friend. We sat together at lunch, and I opened my mouth, ready to speak, but before I could, she asked about homework, and the moment slipped away. I laughed weakly and joined in, my secret sealed tighter than before. It felt safer that way. At least, in silence, I controlled the story. If I spoke, I risked losing even that. The silence seeped into my faith as well. I still knelt in the pew on Sundays, still mouthed the hymns, but my heart was heavy. When the priest spoke of God's protection, I felt a sharp ache. Where was that protection for me? Why had God's shield not stretched over my childhood bed, my trembling prayers, my broken trust? I wrestled with questions I dared not voice. Faith became complicated, still present, but wounded, much like myself. And yet, beneath all the silence, there was a part of me that longed to be found. I dreamed that someone might look into my eyes and see past the forced smiles, that someone might recognize the pain I could not speak. That dream kept me alive in ways I did not fully understand. It gave me a sliver of hope that my story might not always remain buried in shadows. But silence has consequences. It wears on the body as much as the mind. My health began to falter. I grew pale, thin, often sick. My mother took me to doctors who found no clear cause. Stress, they said, growing pains. No one looked deeper. No one asked the questions I was too afraid to answer. My body was screaming the truth, but my voice refused to join in. Years passed this way, each one heavier than the last. My silence became routine, my secrets woven into the fabric of my days. I learned to function, to move through school, to smile when necessary, but beneath it all, I carried the weight like a stone in my chest. I wondered if this was what life would always be, an endless performance, pretending to be whole while hiding the fracture beneath. But silence, no matter how carefully maintained, cannot last forever. The truth has a way of breaking through, even when we fight to keep it buried. For me, that breaking point came not through choice, but through necessity. My body gave out before my voice did. A collapse, sudden and frightening, sent me to the hospital. And it was there, under the harsh light of sterile rooms and the watchful eyes of doctors, that the silence I had guarded so fiercely began to unravel. I do not remember the exact moment when I collapsed. What I recall most is the sudden weakness in my legs, the dizziness that blurred my vision, and the shock of the floor rushing up to meet me. Then came the voices, my mother's panicked cries, the hurried footsteps, the blur of sirens. The silence I had guarded for so long had finally pushed my body past its limit. What I would not say aloud, my body had chosen to reveal. The hospital was cold, sterile, and yet, in a strange way, it felt like a place of truth. Machines hummed, doctors asked questions, nurses checked vitals. For the first time in years, I was being examined closely, seen not as the quiet girl who withdrew from life, but as someone in distress. I should have felt relief, but instead, I was terrified. What if they uncovered the secret I had worked so hard to bury? What if they forced me to speak? Tests were run, questions asked, answers scribbled onto clipboards. A doctor, kind but firm, sat by my bedside and said words I will never forget. This kind of stress, this level of anxiety in someone so young, it usually points to something deeper, something you may not feel ready to talk about yet. His voice was steady, not accusatory, but it pierced through my defenses. I stared at the white sheets, unable to meet his eyes. I wanted to tell him. I wanted someone, anyone, to finally know. But the words caught in my throat. It was not me who spoke first. It was my body language, the tears that fell without warning, the way I flinched when my brothers' names were mentioned in passing. The doctor noticed. He pressed gently, asking questions in careful tones. My silence cracked just slightly. I shook my head, whispered fragments, enough for him to understand that something had happened. He didn't need every detail to see the truth. He saw enough. My parents were called in. I remember the way my mother's face twisted with confusion, then horror, then denial, as the doctor explained what he suspected. She looked at me, searching my face for contradiction, begging me to say it wasn't true. I could not meet her eyes. My silence, my trembling, spoke for me. My father, on the other hand, erupted with anger, not at me, but at the thought of his sons. His fists clenched, his voice rose, and I had never seen such fire in him before. He demanded answers, demanded proof, demanded justice. The confrontation that followed at home is etched into my memory like a scar. We sat once again at the wooden table that had hosted birthdays and stories, but this time the air was heavy with accusation. My father's voice thundered as he named what had been uncovered, his eyes fixed on my brothers. My mother sat rigid, torn between disbelief and a dawning, unbearable realization. And I, shaking, pale, wishing I could sink into the floor, was forced to speak aloud what I had kept hidden for years. My voice broke as the words tumbled out. Not details, not everything, but enough to make the silence shatter completely. I told them I had not felt safe, that I had been hurt, that the people who were meant to protect me had betrayed me. The room spun as the truth finally filled the air. My brothers denied it, of course. They shouted, swore, tried to twist the story. But the truth had already taken root, and it could not be buried again. My father's rage was volcanic. He stood from the table, his chair clattering to the ground, and for a moment I thought he might strike them. Instead, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. My mother sobbed into her hands, and I sat frozen, numb, watching the family I had once clung to splinter before my eyes. The days that followed were chaos. Arguments raged behind closed doors. Neighbors whispered. The police were called, statements taken, investigations launched. My brothers grew colder, angrier, their eyes filled with hatred each time they passed me in the hall. I felt like a stranger in my own home. I had broken the silence, but in doing so, I had broken my family too. There is a strange kind of relief in discovery, but it is a bitter one. For years I had longed for someone to see me, to recognize the truth. And when it finally happened, the cost was unbearable. My father no longer looked at his sons the same. My mother no longer looked at me the same. The home that had once been uneasy but intact was now fractured beyond repair. I remember sitting alone in my room after one of the arguments, hugging my knees to my chest, whispering to myself, "It's not my fault. It's not my fault." The doctor had told me those words, gently, firmly, but believing them was harder than speaking them. Guilt clung to me like a second skin. I knew I had done nothing wrong, yet I felt responsible for the ruin of our family. In courtrooms and offices, my story was repeated in careful clinical terms. Lawyers and judges debated, documents were signed, consequences delivered. I was too young to grasp the full scope of it, but I understood enough to know that life would never return to what it once was. The silence had been shattered, and with it, the illusion of family unity. And yet, in the smallest corners of my heart, there was a flicker of something I had not felt in years, the possibility of healing. For the first time, someone had listened. For the first time, the truth was not mine to bear alone. That did not erase the pain or the betrayal, but it planted the tiniest seed of hope. The discovery was devastating, yes, but it was also the first step toward freedom. Without it, I might have remained chained to silence forever. With it, however painful, came the chance for a new path. I did not know then what that path would look like. I only knew that I could not remain in that house, among those who had wounded me and those too torn to protect me. A decision would be made, one that would uproot me from everything familiar. I would leave behind the only home I had ever known. Not because I wanted to, but because survival demanded it. And so, the chapter of silence ended, and a new chapter began. One marked by distance, uncertainty, and the fragile beginnings of rescue. When the truth was finally spoken aloud, there was no possibility of returning to what had been before. My family had been torn open, the wound exposed, and nothing could stitch it back together. The decision was made quietly but firmly. I could no longer remain in that house. The air was too poisoned, the danger too near, the fractures too deep. It was time to leave. I remember the day I packed my things. My hands shook as I folded clothes into a small suitcase, each piece carrying the scent of a home that was no longer home. I tucked away my notebooks, the ones filled with whispered prayers and half-formed dreams, unsure if I would ever open them again. I slid in the photograph of my mother holding me as a baby, a reminder that once there had been tenderness between us. My father helped me carry the bag to the car, his face hard, unreadable. My mother hovered in the doorway, her eyes red, her body torn between reaching for me and holding herself back. Leaving felt like walking out of one life and into another. As the car pulled away, I stared out the window, watching the house shrink until it was just a speck against the horizon. My chest ached with grief, even after everything. It was still my family, still my childhood home. To walk away from it felt like tearing out a part of myself. Yet beneath the grief was something else, something quieter but undeniable. It was relief. For the first time in years, I felt a breath of safety. The cage had opened, and though I stumbled, I was free of its bars. I was placed under the care of relatives for a time, distant kin who lived in a neighboring town. Their house smelled of cinnamon and old books, their routines steady and unremarkable. They treated me kindly, but I remained withdrawn, unsure how to trust, how to relax. I slept with my suitcase by the bed for weeks, afraid that at any moment I might be sent back. Nightmares still woke me, though now when I bolted upright, I was alone, and that aloneness itself was a comfort. School changed too. I transferred to a new building where no one knew me, where I was not the quiet girl with secrets, but simply the new student. That anonymity gave me space to breathe, though I kept mostly to myself. I listened more than I spoke, observed more than I engaged. Trust was still a foreign language to me, one I no longer believed I could speak. It was during those months that I met someone who would alter the course of my healing. She was a counselor at the school, a woman with kind eyes and a voice that carried both strength and gentleness. She noticed me slipping through the halls like a shadow and invited me into her office. At first, I resisted, offering polite smiles and few words. But she persisted, not by demanding, but by waiting, by offering presence without pressure. Slowly, I began to talk, not all at once, not everything, but small pieces. She listened without judgment, without shock, without rushing me. She gave me something I had not felt in a long time, safety in the presence of another person. In her office, I learned to name what had happened. I learned that it was not my fault, that the shame I carried did not belong to me. She encouraged me to write, to pour my feelings into journals, to give shape to the emotions that twisted inside me. "Your voice matters," she told me. "Even when it trembles, it matters." Those words became a lifeline. It was also through her that I began to rediscover faith in a new light. She spoke of God not as a distant judge, but as a companion in suffering, one who wept when I wept, who held me even in silence. This was not the God of lectures and rules I had grown up hearing about. This was a God of compassion, a God who did not look away from pain. Her words did not erase my doubts, but they planted seeds that would later grow into something stronger. Despite this fragile beginning of healing, life was far from easy. The separation from my family was a constant ache. I missed my mother's lullabies, even if her denial had wounded me. I missed the sense of belonging, even if it had been built on lies. Grief became my companion, walking beside me in the quiet moments. But grief, unlike silence, did not suffocate me. It hurt, yes, but it was honest. I learned to navigate a new normal. My relatives offered stability, meals at the table, small conversations about school and weather. Their ordinary kindness was healing in its own way, though I often felt like an outsider looking in. I was grateful, but I longed for a place where I truly belonged, a place where my scars would not make me a stranger. In those days, I also began to notice how much strength it took simply to keep moving forward. Waking up, attending school, sitting through classes, returning to a house that was safe but not home. These were small victories, though I did not see them as such then. I only knew that I was surviving, one day at a time. Survival, I would later realize, is a form of courage too. Looking back, I see that the breaking away was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the chapter of silence that had defined so much of my childhood. It ended the nights spent listening for footsteps in the hall. It ended the illusion that family alone could be trusted. But it also began something new. It began the slow, fragile process of healing. It began the possibility of trust, even if only with one compassionate adult at first. It began the path that would, years later, lead me to where I sit now, in the quiet of a convent, telling you this story. At the time, I did not know where the path would lead. I only knew that I had taken the first step away from the shadows and toward the light. The breaking away was painful, yes. It tore at my heart and left me adrift. But it was necessary. Without it, I could never have found the life I live now. Without it, I would never have discovered that brokenness does not have to be the end of the story. The months after leaving my family's home were heavy with grief. But within that grief, small seeds of healing began to take root. At first, I barely noticed them. They were like wildflowers growing in the cracks of a broken sidewalk. Fragile, unexpected, easy to overlook. Yet slowly, they began to change me. One of the first seeds came through writing. The counselor who had taken me under her care encouraged me to keep a journal, to let my thoughts spill out without fear of judgment. At first, my entries were no more than fragments, single words, broken sentences, doodles at the edges of the page. But over time, those fragments grew into paragraphs, and those paragraphs grew into stories. I wrote about my pain, about my anger, about the memories I still struggled to put into words aloud. And I also wrote about hope, though faint. My journal became a mirror, reflecting not only my wounds, but also the strength I had never realized I possessed. Another seed came through faith. For so long, I had felt betrayed not only by my brothers, but, in a way, by God. I could not understand why He had allowed me to suffer, why my whispered prayers as a child had gone unanswered. Yet the counselor spoke of God in a way I had never heard before. She told me that God was not absent in my suffering, but present in it, that He had wept with me, even when I thought I was alone. At first, I resisted those words, too bitter to believe them. But they stayed with me, echoing in my heart, and little by little, I began to consider that maybe God's silence had not been abandonment, but companionship too deep for me to recognize. The act of prayer slowly returned to me. Not the rote prayers I had been taught as a child, but raw, unpolished words. Sometimes all I managed was, "Help me." Other times I whispered, "Thank you," when a kind gesture reached me, or a moment of peace came unexpectedly. These small prayers did not erase my doubts, but they reminded me that my voice mattered, not just in the world of people, but before heaven too. School offered its own form of healing. Though I remained quiet, I began to notice the kindness of certain classmates. A girl in my English class invited me to sit with her at lunch. I hesitated, but when I finally joined her, I discovered that she asked nothing of me except my presence. She didn't pry into my past, didn't demand explanations. She simply welcomed me. That simplicity felt like a gift. It reminded me that not every relationship carried hidden dangers, that trust could be possible in small steps. There was also a boy, a gentle soul who noticed me sitting alone in the library one afternoon. He asked if I wanted help with my homework, and though my instinct was to refuse, I found myself nodding. He was patient, respectful, never pressing too far. Over time, his quiet kindness became a steady comfort. I did not yet understand what it meant to allow someone to treat me with dignity and care, but his presence began to teach me. Healing did not come in a straight line. There were setbacks, days when nightmares dragged me backward, when guilt or anger threatened to consume me. There were mornings when I could barely pull myself out of bed, convinced that the weight of my past was too heavy to carry. But then there were other days when laughter escaped my lips without warning, when the sun on my face felt like a blessing, when I realized that survival was slowly blossoming into something more. The counselor often reminded me that healing was not about forgetting. "The past will always be part of your story," she said, "but it doesn't have to be the ending." I clung to those words. They gave me permission to hope that my life could be defined not only by what had been done to me, but by what I chose to build afterward. I began to imagine a future again, something I had not allowed myself to do in years. I thought about college, about studying education, about maybe standing in front of a classroom one day just as I had once dreamed. I thought about traveling, about seeing the world beyond the small towns I had known. These dreams were fragile, but they were mine. And they reminded me that I was more than a victim. I was still a person with choices, with potential, with life ahead of me. One night, sitting by the window with my journal in my lap, I wrote a sentence that surprised me. Maybe one day I will use my story to help others. At the time, I didn't know what that meant. I only knew that the idea of turning my pain into purpose stirred something inside me. Perhaps God could redeem even this. Perhaps my wounds could become a source of light for someone else stumbling in the dark. These were the seeds, the writing, the faith, the friendships, the dreams. They were not enough to erase the pain, but they were enough to keep me moving. And though I didn't realize it then, they were also the beginning of a deeper call. A call that would one day lead me to dedicate my entire life to God. For now, though, I was simply learning to breathe again, to smile again, to believe again. Healing was slow, imperfect, often painful, but it was real. And with each small step, I began to see that brokenness could give way to something new. As the years passed, I discovered that healing is not simply about moving forward. It is also about circling back, about finding ways to confront the past without being consumed by it. For me, that confrontation came through letters I never intended to send, but letters that became a bridge between silence and voice. It began one afternoon when the counselor placed a blank sheet of paper before me. "Write to them," she said gently. "Say the things you were never able to say. You don't have to send it. You don't even have to keep it. But let the words leave your body. Let them belong to the page instead of to your silence." At first, the thought terrified me. To address my brothers directly, even in ink, felt like opening a wound I had fought to keep stitched. But the longer I stared at the empty page, the more I realized how much I longed to unburden myself. And so, trembling, I began. The words came haltingly at first. I wrote of betrayal, of the way they had stolen not only my safety, but my childhood. I wrote of nights spent awake, listening for their footsteps. I wrote of prayers whispered into darkness, prayers that felt unanswered. My hand shook as I formed each sentence, but with every line I felt a small measure of release. The paper carried the weight that my voice had been too weak to bear. Those first letters were raw, filled with anger and sorrow. I accused them. I condemned them. I poured out the rage I had swallowed for years. But over time, as the pages multiplied, something shifted. The anger remained, but it was joined by grief for what I had lost, for what they had become, for the family that had been torn apart. Eventually, even compassion began to creep in, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement of the brokenness that must have lived in them to cause such harm. I never sent a single letter. Most of them I tore into pieces and burned, watching the smoke curl upward as though carrying my words to heaven. But the act itself changed me. It gave me a voice where once I had none. It allowed me to reclaim power over a story that had always felt stolen. In the privacy of those letters, I also wrote to my parents. To my mother, I confessed my hurt at her silence, her denial, her inability to shield me. To my father, I admitted both gratitude for his anger and sorrow for the distance that grew between us afterward. I wrote what I could never say aloud, and though the words never reached their ears, they reached me. They freed me from the prison of unspoken truth. Perhaps the most surprising letters, though, were the ones I wrote to myself. I addressed the frightened little girl who had once begged God to make her invisible. I told her she was brave, that she had survived what should have crushed her. I told her she was not to blame, that the shame she carried did not belong to her. Writing to that younger version of myself felt strange at first, but soon it became a lifeline. For the first time, I began to see myself not only as a victim, but as someone worthy of compassion. The letters did not erase the past, but they softened its hold. Nightmares still came, but less often. The sight of my own reflection no longer startled me as it once had. I began to see a young woman who had endured storms and was still standing. And slowly I began to believe that my life could be built on more than survival. During college, the practice of writing deepened. I studied literature and education, immersing myself in words that carried the weight of human experience. I read stories of resilience, of loss, of redemption, and I recognized fragments of my own journey in their pages. Writing was no longer just therapy. It became vocation, a way of shaping meaning from pain. It was also in those years that the boy I had met in the library, the one whose kindness had first surprised me, grew closer. His friendship became a steady presence, a reminder that not every relationship was tainted by betrayal. He respected my boundaries, never pressing when I retreated, always offering quiet understanding. Over time, I allowed myself to trust him, to believe that perhaps love, gentle, patient, real love, was possible for me too. Still, the letters remained my most private sanctuary. I wrote to God as well, not the God I had once feared, but the God I was slowly learning to see anew. I don't understand why you let it happen, I wrote once, but I want to believe you were there anyway. On another page, if you can use even this pain, then show me how. These prayers in ink became conversations I could not yet form aloud, and through them I began to sense a call that I did not yet recognize fully, a call that would, in time, lead me to surrender my life entirely into his hands. Closure is often misunderstood. It is not forgetting. It is not excusing. Closure, for me, was the moment I realized that my story no longer belonged to those who had harmed me. It belonged to me. The letters helped me see that. Each torn page, each burned scrap, each word released into the air was a thread cut from the web that had once bound me. I cannot say that closure came all at once. It was a slow process, marked by setbacks and doubts. But I can say this: the act of writing, of naming what had been hidden, opened a door I never thought I would walk through. It allowed me to step beyond survival into the beginning of freedom. And so, as I stacked my journals on the shelf, I knew something had changed. I was not yet whole, but I was no longer defined solely by what had been done to me. I was beginning to define myself by what I chose to create, by the words I wrote, by the life I was shaping. Those seeds of healing had grown into something sturdier, and now, with the letters as my witness, I could finally take the next step. That step would not lead me into marriage or the ordinary path I once imagined. It would lead me toward a deeper surrender, a calling I had not expected, a vow that would bind me not to man, but to Christ. By the time I finished college, my life no longer resembled the silence-shrouded childhood I had once endured. The girl who wrote prayers begging to be invisible had grown into a woman who dared to dream again. Yet even as I studied, made friends, and began to build a semblance of a future, there remained an emptiness inside me, a space I could not fill with books or laughter or even love. That emptiness, I came to realize, was not a curse, but a calling. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. During quiet moments in the campus chapel, I found myself lingering longer than I intended, drawn not by obligation, but by an ache I could not explain. The flicker of candlelight, the stillness of the pews, the sound of whispered prayers around me, all of it stirred something deep in my soul. For the first time, I wondered if the silence I had once hated might hold a different meaning. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of God's presence. My friendship with the boy from the library blossomed during those years. He was patient and kind, and for a time, I imagined that perhaps my story might end in marriage, children, the ordinary rhythms of life. We shared conversations that stretched late into the night, dreams of the future, confessions of fears. He never pressured me, never demanded more than I could give. If anything, his respect deepened my trust. Yet, even in the warmth of his presence, I felt the pull of something else, something beyond human companionship. One evening, after attending a retreat organized by the campus ministry, the pull became undeniable. The retreat was simple. Days filled with prayer, silence, and reflection. But in that silence, I heard what I can only describe as a whisper from God. Come to me. Give me your life. I resisted at first. Surely I was imagining it. Surely God could not be calling someone like me, someone fractured, someone scarred. Yet the more I resisted, the stronger the whisper became. I returned from that retreat unsettled. I tried to push the thought aside, to bury it as I had once buried my pain. But this was different. It was not fear holding me captive. It was love drawing me forward. I began to spend more time in prayer, seeking clarity. The emptiness I had carried for so long now felt like a space carved out for God Himself. When I finally spoke to the boy about what I was feeling, his response stunned me. He listened quietly, then nodded with a kind of reverence. "If that is what you're called to," he said softly, "then you must follow it. You've spent too long letting others decide your story. This one must be yours." His words released me from guilt. I realized that choosing Christ did not diminish what He had given me. If anything, His friendship had prepared me to recognize what real love looked like: selfless, patient, freeing. The decision did not come overnight. I wrestled with it, questioning whether I was strong enough, holy enough, healed enough. Could someone with my past truly dedicate her life to God? Wouldn't the shadows of betrayal taint the vows I longed to make? But in every doubt, I found the same answer rising. God does not call the unbroken. He calls the willing, and I was willing. In time, I sought guidance from a mentor nun, a woman whose presence radiated peace. I confessed my fears to her, my doubts, my sense of unworthiness. She smiled gently and said, "Child, your scars are not barriers to God. They are bridges. Through them, you will reach others who feel lost because you have walked their road. Do not hide your wounds, offer them." Those words struck me like lightning. For the first time, I saw my past not as disqualification, but as part of the very reason I was called. The day I entered the convent was both solemn and joyous. I carried with me my journals, my faith, and my scars, placing them all before God as my offering. The sound of the chapel bells rang as I crossed the threshold, and in that moment, I knew I was stepping into the life I had been meant for all along. I was not escaping the world. I was embracing a deeper truth. I was not running from pain. I was allowing God to transform it. Taking the veil, I became Sister Marian, a bride of Christ. The vows I spoke of poverty, chastity, obedience were not chains, but liberation. They were my way of saying, betrayal no longer defines me, silence no longer imprisons me, fear no longer dictates my steps. My life belonged to God, and in Him I found the love that could never be taken away. Looking back now, I see that every step, every wound, every letter, every prayer had been leading me here. The path was never straight, never easy, but it was purposeful. What I once believed would destroy me had, in God's hands, been woven into a calling greater than I could have imagined. Embracing vocation did not erase the past, but it gave it meaning. It turned scars into testimony, silence into service, betrayal into a strange and sacred offering. I learned that to be a bride of Christ was not to forget the girl I once was, but to honor her, to give her suffering a place of redemption. And so, in the quiet of the convent, I finally understood. My life had not been stolen, though betrayal had tried. It had been transformed. And in that transformation, I found freedom, purpose, and the unshakable love of God. The years that have passed since I entered the convent have been quiet ones, yet filled with a richness I never could have imagined as a frightened child. Each morning I rise before dawn, the chapel bells guiding me into prayer. The rhythms of this life are steady: work, prayer, silence, service. And in that steadiness, I have found a healing deeper than I thought possible. People sometimes ask me if I regret my choice, if I wish I had taken a different path. I smile, because I know what they are really asking. How could someone who was betrayed by love choose a life defined by devotion? The answer is simple. My vocation was never about running from pain. It was about transforming it. It was about letting God take what was broken in me and make it a vessel for others. I now work with young people, many of whom carry burdens they are too afraid to name. Some come to me in tears, speaking of loneliness, of family fractures, of fears they cannot share with anyone else. When I listen to them, I see glimpses of myself at their age, eyes downcast, voice trembling, spirit weighed down by silence. And when I tell them gently, "You are not alone. Your voice matters," I am not speaking as a teacher or counselor alone. I am speaking as someone who knows the crushing weight of silence and the freedom that comes when truth is spoken. My scars have become my testimony. I do not hide them, though I do not dwell on them either. When I share my story, I do so with careful words, never graphic, never sensational, but always honest. I tell them that betrayal nearly destroyed me, but it did not have the final word. I tell them that even when God felt distant, His love was still holding me. And I tell them that healing is possible, though it comes slowly, like dawn creeping across a dark horizon. Service has given me purpose. I teach in a small parish school, guiding children through lessons not only of reading and arithmetic, but also of kindness, respect, and resilience. I mentor young women discerning their own paths, reminding them that worth is not defined by what has been done to them, but by the dignity God has placed within them. And in every act of service, I feel a quiet joy, a joy born not from forgetting my pain, but from redeeming it. There are still nights when the old shadows visit me. A dream may jolt me awake, or a memory may rise unbidden. But those moments no longer paralyze me. I rise, I light a candle, and I pray. I remind myself that I am no longer that silenced child. I am Sister Marian, a bride of Christ, and my scars no longer speak of defeat. They speak of survival. They speak of grace. I sometimes wonder about my brothers. I do not hate them anymore, though I cannot forget what they did. Hatred is a chain, and I have no desire to wear it. I have prayed for them, not for reconciliation, but for their souls, that they might confront their sins and find repentance. Whether they ever will is not mine to know. My task is simply to live free of the weight they once placed upon me. As for my parents, my relationship with them remains complicated. My father passed years ago, and I like to believe he carried with him both the sorrow of what had been lost and the pride of knowing his daughter had found a life of strength. My mother and I speak occasionally, our words gentle but distant. I have forgiven her, not because she earned it, but because forgiveness was the only way for me to be free. In the stillness of convent life, I often think of the girl I once was, the girl who scribbled desperate prayers into notebooks, who stacked furniture against her bedroom door, who thought she might never be safe. If I could reach back through time, I would take her hands in mine and whisper, "You will survive. You will heal. One day, you will even thrive." I cannot go back, but I can honor her by living fully now, and so my life has become a living testimony. I am not defined by betrayal, though it shaped me. I am not bound by silence, though it once held me captive. I am defined instead by resilience, by faith, by the choice to serve. The world may look at me and see only a nun, a woman in a black habit living behind convent walls. But I know the truth. I am a survivor, a teacher, a sister, a servant of Christ. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: pain does not have to be the end. Silence does not have to be permanent. Betrayal does not have to be the final word. Your story, no matter how broken, can still be redeemed. I began this confession by admitting the jagged truth of my past. I end it now with something softer, something stronger. My life was destroyed once by betrayal, but through God's grace, it was remade into something new. And today, as I walk these convent halls, I know with unshakable certainty that I am exactly where I was meant to be. Scarred, yes, but also whole.